Under the soft light of the courtroom, an old man stood near the witness stand, his shoulders straight as if the years of service still lived inside his bones. His name was Edward Blake, once a royal guard who had served his country with quiet pride. His uniform, though aged and slightly faded, looked spotless, ironed carefully, every button polished by hand. On the left side of his chest rested a row of medals that told stories of duty and pain. Among them shone the small bronze cross that had once been pinned on him by the Queen herself. The Victoria Cross, the medal that few ever received and fewer ever lived to wear. The courtroom was filled with quiet murmurs as people took their seats. The judge entered, an older man with sharp eyes and a tone that demanded order. The guards called for silence, and soon only the ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard. The judge sat down and scanned the room, then his gaze stopped on Edward. For a moment he said nothing, perhaps surprised to see the old soldier wearing his full uniform inside a courtroom. His eyes narrowed slightly when they reached the medals, especially the one that caught the light like a small flame. "Captain Edward Blake," the judge said, his voice firm, "this court appreciates your service. However, the courtroom is not the place for military display. Please remove your medals before you testify." The room grew still. Even the people sitting in the back rows looked up from their papers. Edward didn't move right away. He stood silent, his blue eyes steady, his gloved hands resting by his sides. His medals weren't meant to show off pride. They were pieces of his past, the only memories of the men he had once led. But rules were rules, and he had always lived by them. Still, for a moment, his hand moved slightly over the cross, his thumb brushing against the edge as if touching an old wound. The judge waited, then spoke again, this time more firmly. "Mr. Blake, you are required to remove all military decorations before speaking under oath." A quiet cough came from the front row. Someone whispered, "That's the Victoria Cross." But the judge didn't seem to hear it. He looked only at the man standing in front of him. Edward's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. Memory. His medals weren't about glory. They were about faces, friends, and nights that still came back in dreams. He took a slow breath and reached up. The courtroom air seemed heavier, as the small sound of the clasp opening echoed through the silence. One by one, he began to unpin the medals. When his hand reached the Victoria Cross, he stopped. The medal was cool, yet it felt warm with everything it carried. The day he received it had not been one of pride, but of sorrow. He had stood before the Queen, but all he could think about were the men who didn't come home. Their laughter, their voices, their bravery, all gone. He had promised himself that as long as he wore this medal, their memory would live too. Now standing before the judge, he felt that weight again. But Edward Blake had always believed in respect and in the law. Slowly, he unclipped the medal and placed it on the wooden table before him. The sound of metal touching wood was faint, but to him it sounded like a farewell. He didn't look at it again. The judge gave a small nod, satisfied that order had been restored. "Thank you, Mr. Blake," he said, then gestured for him to take his seat. Edward moved to the witness stand with quiet dignity, his steps measured, his back straight. Even without the medals, he looked every bit the soldier he once was. A young lawyer sitting across from him smirked slightly, not out of cruelty, but with the kind of arrogance that comes from youth. To him, Edward was just another old man, another witness in a long case that had nothing to do with war or courage. The lawyer flipped through his papers carelessly while the judge began reading from the file. Outside the tall courtroom windows, sunlight broke through a cloud, falling across the wooden panels and catching the faint reflection of the Victoria Cross where it lay forgotten for the moment. One of the journalists sitting in the back noticed it, her pen pausing mid-sentence. She recognized the medal and the name. She had read it years ago, during a time when headlines still spoke of bravery and sacrifice. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. Inside, Edward sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't mind the silence. He had lived with silence most of his life. He had seen things in the field that made words feel small. He was not there to talk about himself. He was there because someone needed his word, and that was all he had ever offered: honesty. The judge called the session to order again, and the first questions began. But as the young lawyer started to speak, Edward's mind wandered briefly. He could still hear the echo of his comrades' laughter. The memories were like fading pictures, faces in the dust, the sound of rain on tin roofs, the smell of the old barracks. He had lived long enough to know that time takes everything except memory. In the quiet between questions, the judge glanced again at the table. The small medal still rested there. For a moment, something softened in his expression. He didn't know yet what it meant, not fully. But something in the old man's eyes made him pause before moving to the next point. The questions came and went, the formality of the court pressing on every word. Yet beneath it all there was something stirring, a faint recognition that the man sitting before them wasn't ordinary. There was dignity in the way Edward spoke, in the way he listened before answering. There was patience, not the kind that comes from waiting, but the kind that is learned through years of discipline and pain. When the session paused for a brief moment, Edward turned slightly toward the table. His eyes rested on the medal for just a heartbeat. In that look was everything: the years, the cost, the pride, and the loss. The judge noticed, and for reasons he couldn't explain, felt a flicker of respect. By the time the first part of the hearing ended, no one had spoken of it again. But something had changed in the room. The people who had entered the courtroom seeing only an old man now looked at him differently. They didn't yet know his story. They didn't know what the Victoria Cross had meant or what it had cost him. But they could feel it, a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. As Edward stood to leave for the short recess, he glanced back once more at the table. The medal caught the afternoon light and shimmered softly, like a memory refusing to fade. He thought of the men who had once stood beside him and whispered in his heart, "I'm still carrying you all." Then he walked out of the courtroom, his steps calm and unshaken. The world might not understand the meaning of a medal, but he knew that real honor was never worn on the chest. It was carried inside in silence, through every trial that life could give. And though the judge didn't yet realize who he had asked to remove that small piece of bronze, the truth was waiting, and soon it would change everything that happened in that courtroom. The next morning, the courtroom was filled again. Sunlight streamed through the high glass windows, making long shadows stretch across the floor. People entered quietly, their shoes clicking against the marble. Reporters filled the back benches, whispering softly about the strange case involving an old royal guard and a veteran's home. Captain Edward Blake sat alone at the side bench, his cap resting on his knees. He looked calm, but behind that calm face was a man carrying years of stories no one had asked to hear. The judge arrived on time, his black robe flowing as he took his seat. The sound of the gavel echoed. "Court in session," he said. The clerk called the case again, a property dispute between a private corporation and a veterans' charity. The company wanted to take over the land where the old soldiers' home stood, claiming ownership papers from long ago. Edward had been called as a witness because he had helped build that place with his own hands. He stood when his name was called, walking slowly toward the witness stand. His steps were firm, even though his knees ached slightly with every movement. The young lawyer for the corporation, a man named Charles Grant, smiled with confidence as he looked at him. Charles was sharp, dressed perfectly, his tie knotted just right. To him, Edward Blake was only a symbol of the past, a polite old man who would soon lose his place in a modern world that no longer remembered such men. When Edward sat down, the lawyer adjusted his papers and began in a smooth, almost rehearsed voice. "Mr. Blake, you're aware that the property known as the Royal Veterans Rest Home is under dispute, correct?" "Yes," Edward answered simply. His voice was low, steady, and respectful. "And you're here to claim that the land belongs to the Charity Foundation," Charles continued, "because it was supposedly donated years ago by a private benefactor. Do you have any written proof of that donation?" Edward shook his head slightly. "No, sir. But I was there when the foundation was formed. I was part of it." The lawyer smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I see. So your testimony is based on memory, not evidence. Interesting." Edward didn't react. He had dealt with worse in his life: bullets, fire, loss. A young man's sarcasm could not shake him. "Memory can be evidence," he said quietly. "When it's all that's left, it matters." The courtroom murmured softly. Some people nodded. The judge looked at Edward, a trace of interest showing on his face. Charles, however, pressed forward. "Mr. Blake, with all due respect, the world runs on documents, not memories. If there's no paper to prove your claim, then this is just sentiment." Edward looked at him for a long second, not in anger but in pity. "Sometimes, sir," he said calmly, "sentiment is what built the world you live in." The judge's hand paused mid-note. The room was silent. Even Charles seemed unsure of what to say next. The questioning continued, but something in the air had changed. The young lawyer's voice grew sharper, trying to find weakness in Edward's words. He asked about the year the home was built, about the people involved, about how the funding was gathered. Edward answered each question with clarity. His words painted a picture: a group of retired soldiers, widows, and volunteers working together to build a small haven for those who had nowhere else to go. "We had nothing fancy," Edward said, his voice softening. "Just our hands and the will to make sure no soldier would ever sleep cold again." One of the jurors, a woman with gray hair, leaned forward, her eyes growing moist. She whispered something to the person beside her, perhaps remembering someone she once knew who had worn a uniform like his. Charles cleared his throat and changed his approach. "Mr. Blake, let's talk about you for a moment. You served as a Royal Guard, correct?" "Yes. And you were awarded the Victoria Cross." Edward nodded slightly, saying nothing more. The lawyer smiled thinly. "That's quite an honor. But this courtroom isn't a parade ground. Heroic stories don't prove land ownership, do they?" The remark earned a small gasp from the audience. The judge looked sharply at the young man. "Mr. Grant," he said sternly, "you will keep your remarks professional." Charles lowered his eyes briefly. "Apologies, Your Honor." Then he turned back to Edward, trying to regain control. "Tell me, Captain Blake, what exactly gives you the right to speak for the charity? You're not its founder, are you?" "No," Edward said softly, "but I was one of the first to move in. I helped lay the first stone. And you believe that makes you qualified to decide what happens to it?" Edward's eyes lifted toward him. "No," he said simply. "But I believe those who bled for their country deserve a roof over their heads." The lawyer hesitated. For a brief moment, his confident expression faltered. The silence in the courtroom stretched longer than expected. The judge looked at Edward, studying him. Something about the man's calmness, the steady tone of his voice, carried weight. He wasn't loud, yet everything he said reached everyone in the room. Charles tried to continue. "So you're saying this is not about law, but about emotion?" "It's about honor," Edward replied. "And I believe the law was made to protect that." The young lawyer looked lost for words. The judge leaned slightly forward, his eyes thoughtful. Somewhere in the back, the same journalist from the day before was writing quickly. She recognized what was happening. This wasn't just a witness giving answers. This was a man reminding the court of something it had forgotten: the human heart behind justice. After a pause, the judge finally spoke. "Mr. Blake, could you tell us why this home means so much to you?" Edward turned toward him. His voice softened. "Because it's not just a building, Your Honor. It's the last home for many who gave everything they had. Some of them never had families left. They came here because it was the only place that still called them by name." He looked down for a moment, as if seeing faces no one else could see. "I promised them it would always be theirs. That's why I'm here. To keep that promise." The judge said nothing for several seconds. The room stayed silent. Even Charles didn't speak. The sound of paper rustling was the only thing that broke the stillness. When the court finally took a short recess, people turned and whispered among themselves. The story of the old soldier was spreading quietly through the crowd. Some of them remembered reading about him long ago. The man who went back into the battlefield 3 times when everyone thought he was gone. The name Captain Edward Blake began to stir something in the hearts of those who had forgotten what it meant. Edward sat down again, his hands resting on his knees. The Victoria Cross still lay on the table beside him. The light from the window touched it, making it shine faintly like a living memory. He didn't look at it, but he felt its presence, as if those who had once stood beside him were watching quietly, giving him strength. Charles Grant gathered his papers with frustration, feeling the balance of the room shift. The judge, usually cold and distant, now looked thoughtful. The people in the courtroom were no longer on the company's side. They were looking at the quiet man with respect, even admiration. When the session resumed, the judge's tone had changed. His questions were no longer just formal. There was something more human in them. The courtroom, once filled with rules and procedures, now carried the sound of something different: truth, spoken gently but firmly by a man who had seen life at its hardest and still believed in doing what was right. And though Edward said little more that day, his silence spoke louder than any argument. In his calm eyes, the whole room saw something they had long forgotten: that real strength doesn't shout. It endures. It stands steady even when the world tries to tear it down. The young lawyer didn't yet realize it, but from that moment on, the case had already begun to turn. The judge had started to see beyond the rules, beyond the papers. He was beginning to see the man behind the witness stand, the man he had once ordered to remove his medal. And slowly, quietly, his heart was changing. The courtroom was filled again the next morning, and everyone could feel that something was different. People were no longer whispering about property laws or old documents. They were talking about the man in the corner seat, the old royal guard who had spoken with such quiet strength. Captain Edward Blake walked in slowly, his steps measured, his cap tucked under his arm. His face was calm, but there was a small tiredness in his eyes, the kind that comes from years of carrying heavy memories. The young lawyer, Charles Grant, was already there, flipping through his notes. He looked more serious now, less confident than before. He had stayed up late the night before, searching Edward's name on the internet, reading the old reports. He had found news articles from years ago about a British officer who had performed something extraordinary during a war. The story was unbelievable, a man who had risked his life 3 times in one night to save others. And the name had been the same, Captain Edward Blake. When the judge entered and the session began, Charles looked at Edward, wondering if it could really be him. He had read about the rescue in Helmand Province, how Edward had gone back under fire to pull his soldiers out one by one, even after being wounded. He had refused evacuation until the last man was safe. He had been found half-conscious beside the last soldier he had carried, still trying to shield him from harm. For that, he had been awarded the Victoria Cross. But seeing him now, sitting quietly in a courtroom about a property dispute, seemed almost unreal. Charles couldn't decide whether to feel respect or shame. He had mocked the man's medal 2 days ago without knowing what it meant. The hearing began. The corporation's representative spoke first, presenting old ownership records. The lawyer used big words, confident tones, long sentences, but the judge wasn't looking at him. His eyes rested on Edward. The courtroom air felt heavier, as if everyone knew that something much deeper than paperwork was about to surface. When it was Edward's turn to speak again, the judge allowed it with a nod. The old man stood slowly, his back straight despite the stiffness in his joints. He spoke in a voice calm and steady. "Your Honor," he began, "I have listened to every word, and I know rules are important. I wore a uniform all my life because I believed in discipline and duty. But there are times when rules must serve something higher, the truth." The judge nodded slightly, encouraging him to go on. Edward continued. "You see, I didn't come here for myself. I came because that home means more than bricks or land. It was built by men who had nothing left except loyalty to each other. Some were wounded. Some had lost everything, but they gave what little they had to make sure no one was forgotten." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Everyone listened. Charles looked down, unable to meet his eyes. One of the jurors asked politely, "Mr. Blake, may we ask when you served?" Edward's gaze lowered for a moment. "A long time ago," he said quietly. "Afghanistan." Helmand Province, the name made the judge pause. He recognized it. "That's where—" he began but didn't finish the sentence. Edward gave a small nod. "Yes, Your Honor, that's where it happened." There was silence. The judge leaned back slightly. His eyes softened. "Mr. Blake," he said slowly, "forgive my ignorance, but are you the same Captain Blake who received the Victoria Cross for that mission?" Edward looked down, his hands clasped together. "I don't talk about it much," he said. "It wasn't just me. It was a team effort. I just did what I had to do." The room was still. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment. The same man they had seen ordered to remove his medal was now standing before them, not just a witness but a living piece of history. The judge's face changed completely. His voice softened. "Mr. Blake," he said, "I remember that story. I remember reading about your courage. You went back 3 times for your men." Edward nodded faintly. "Yes, sir. But bravery is not about medals. It's about not leaving anyone behind." The judge swallowed hard and looked at the medal resting on the table. It shone faintly in the light like a quiet reminder of everything that had been endured. The lawyer, Charles, couldn't stay silent anymore. He rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, I had no idea who he was when I spoke before. I didn't mean any disrespect." Edward turned his head and looked at him. His eyes were kind, not angry. "You were doing your job," he said softly. "We all follow orders." That line made the room go silent again. The meaning in it was clear. He wasn't blaming anyone. He was forgiving him. The judge took off his glasses and set them on the bench. "Captain Blake," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. I did not recognize you when I asked you to remove your medal the first day. That was not just a decoration. That was a part of history." Edward smiled faintly. "It's only metal, Your Honor. The real history is in the men who didn't make it back." The judge's throat tightened. He cleared his voice softly. "Still," he said, "the court owes you respect." The next few minutes were filled with quiet awe. The corporate lawyer sat back, silent now, while the judge leaned forward with genuine interest. He asked Edward about his service, not as part of the case, but out of human curiosity. "Tell me," he said gently, "what made you go back even after being wounded?" Edward took a breath. "Because I could hear them calling," he said. "They were my men. You don't leave your men behind no matter how dark it gets. I knew if I didn't go, I'd never sleep again." The judge nodded slowly. "And you carried them out yourself?" Edward looked down. "Yes, one by one. I wasn't fast, but I got them all. When I came back with the last one, I couldn't walk anymore, but it didn't matter. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone quietly wiping away tears in the back row. The judge looked at him with deep respect. "You call that only doing your job, Captain?" Edward smiled gently. "Yes, Your Honor, that's what we were trained for. Duty doesn't ask for thanks. It just asks you to do what's right." The judge leaned back again, his eyes full of thought. "Perhaps the rest of us could learn from that," he said softly. When the session ended, people didn't rush to leave as they usually did. They stayed seated, as if something sacred had passed through the room. The young lawyer walked over to Edward quietly. "Sir," he said awkwardly, "I hope you'll forgive my earlier behavior." "I truly didn't know." Edward looked at him kindly. "Of course," he said. "We all learn in time." Charles hesitated, then asked, "Did it hurt? To give that medal up the first day?" Edward smiled faintly. "No, it hurt more to see people forget what it stands for." The lawyer didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, his pride replaced by something more human. As Edward left the courtroom that day, a light rain began outside. Reporters followed, but he said nothing. He didn't like attention. He walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the damp wind brushing his face. For a brief moment he looked up at the gray sky and whispered something under his breath. A name, perhaps. One of the men he had lost long ago. The journalist from before stood nearby, holding her notebook. She didn't call out to him. She just watched as he disappeared into the street, walking alone, yet somehow larger than life. Inside, the judge sat quietly in his chair, staring at the medal still lying on the table. He reached out and touched it gently with his fingertips. Then he whispered softly, "Some men never stop serving, even when the war is over." He sat there for a long time after everyone had gone, the courtroom empty and still, the echo of the old soldier's words lingering like a promise that would not fade. The next morning, the air in the courtroom felt different. It was no longer just a legal hall filled with tension and quiet whispers. There was a strange warmth in the air, a sense that something true and human had begun to surface. When Captain Edward Blake entered, every person turned their head toward him, not because of his uniform or his medals, but because of what they now knew about the man behind them. He walked slowly but proudly, his steps steady as always, his expression calm and thoughtful. The young lawyer Charles Grant was already seated, his posture straighter than usual, his voice quiet when he greeted the old soldier. He had spent the night thinking about everything he had heard. The story of the rescue in Helmand province had replayed in his mind again and again. He couldn't stop seeing the image of that man crawling through dust and danger to save others. It made his own struggles in the courtroom seem small and hollow. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The gavel hit the desk and the sound echoed softly through the chamber. "This court will continue the case of Royal Veterans Rest Home versus Grant and Properties," the judge said. His tone was calm, but beneath it was something gentler, something that hadn't been there before. Edward sat down slowly. The medal he had removed on the first day still lay on the judge's desk, where it had remained untouched since the last session. The light from the high window fell on it again, and it shimmered faintly like a quiet star. The judge's eyes flicked toward it for a brief moment before looking back at Edward. The corporation's lawyer began to speak again, but this time his voice lacked its earlier force. "Your Honor," he said, "we maintain that the land was improperly claimed by the Veterans Charity and legally belongs to Granton Properties. While we respect Mr. Blake's service, the case must still be decided by the law." The judge nodded slowly. "Indeed," he said, "by the law, see, and by the truth." Then he turned toward Edward. "Captain Blake, I have some questions for you if you are willing." Edward stood up respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked thoughtful. "You said this home was built by veterans themselves. Could you tell us what made you start it? Was it just a shelter or something more?" Edward paused, his eyes distant as if he were seeing the past again. "It began after the war," he said softly. "Many of us came home, but not all of us had a home to go to. Some were hurt. Some couldn't find work, so we gathered what we had and built something together. It was small, just a few rooms at first. We called it the Royal Veterans Rest Home because that's what it was. A place to rest." He smiled faintly, his voice steady. "We didn't build it with money. We built it with memories and promises. Every brick in that wall means something. Some of the men who laid those bricks are gone now, but their names are still there, carved in small letters on the foundation stones." The judge leaned forward slightly, listening closely. The room was silent except for Edward's soft, steady words. Charles Grant looked down at his own papers. The pages were full of rules and property terms, but suddenly they felt meaningless. He knew then that the old soldier's voice carried more truth than any document he could ever show. The judge nodded. "Captain Blake," he said, "the world owes much to men like you. I believe I speak for everyone here when I say that your courage humbles this court." Edward shook his head slowly. "Please, Your Honor, I didn't come for praise. I came to protect what belongs to those who can't fight anymore. It's not about me." For a long moment no one spoke. Then the judge looked down at the Victoria Cross still lying on the desk. He picked it up carefully, holding it in both hands. The small metal looked almost too delicate to carry so much meaning. "Captain Blake," the judge said quietly, "on the first day, I asked you to remove this medal. I did so because I believed the courtroom must remain neutral. But now I realize I was wrong. Some symbols are not about pride. They are about sacrifice." He stood slowly. The courtroom held its breath. "I cannot undo what I said," the judge continued, "but I can correct it. Please, Captain Blake, will you step forward?" Edward blinked, surprised. The quiet rustle of movement filled the air as everyone watched him rise. He walked slowly to the judge's bench, his polished shoes tapping softly on the marble floor. His posture remained straight, though his heart felt heavy and humbled. The judge looked at him with genuine respect. "On behalf of this court and in the name of every person who has ever known freedom because of men like you, I would like to return this to where it belongs." He reached forward and, with both hands, fastened the medal gently onto Edward's chest. The simple act filled the room with silence so deep that one could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. The judge's voice was low but clear. "Some honors belong wherever their bearers stand." A murmur swept through the crowd. Then one by one people began to rise from their seats. First the jurors, then the clerks, and finally even Charles Grant. In a moment that none of them had expected, the entire courtroom stood on its feet, not because they were told to, but because they felt they should. The judge stepped back slightly, still looking at Edward. "You may not consider yourself a hero," he said, "but today you reminded us what that word truly means." Edward's eyes were moist, but he didn't speak. He simply gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his voice caught in his throat. For him, this was not a moment of glory. It was a moment of remembrance, and for all those who never made it back to see such a day. The judge sat down slowly, his voice softer now. "Let it be noted," he said to the clerk, "that this court recognizes Captain Edward Blake as an individual of extraordinary character and service. His testimony shall be given the highest respect." The clerk wrote the words carefully, her hand trembling slightly. As Edward returned to his seat, everyone remained standing. The young lawyer, moved beyond words, lowered his head in quiet respect. He felt ashamed for his earlier arrogance, but also grateful for having witnessed something real, something pure. When Edward sat down, the metal glinted softly against his uniform. He did not touch it, but a faint smile crossed his lips, not of pride, but of peace. He thought of his old friends, the ones who had shared the same dust and fear years ago. "This is for you," he whispered in his heart. The judge cleared his throat and spoke again, this time with warmth. "The court will now take a short recess." As he stood to leave, he turned once more toward Edward and gave him a small nod, a gesture not of authority, but of respect, the kind one soldier gives to another. People began to whisper quietly, but it wasn't gossip anymore. It was admiration. Some even clapped softly, though the judge didn't call for silence. He let it happen. It was a rare moment where rules gave way to humanity. Edward sat still through it all, humbled but calm. He didn't seek applause, but he accepted it quietly, knowing it wasn't for him alone. It was for every man and woman who had ever given something for others. When the crowd slowly settled again, the light through the windows changed. The medal on his chest caught it perfectly, shining like a small sun against the dark uniform. The old soldier looked down at it for a brief moment, and in that shine, he didn't see glory. He saw the faces of his brothers in arms, smiling back at him as if they too were standing there in that courtroom, proud and alive once more. The judge watched him with a soft expression before quietly saying, "Captain Blake, I believe this country stands taller because of people like you." Edward nodded politely. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just tried to do my duty, the same as any of them would have." The gavel struck again, but this time it didn't sound like judgment. It sounded like honor being restored. And for the first time since he had entered that courtroom, Edward Blake allowed himself to take a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly from his shoulders. The medal rested against his heart again, right where it belonged. When the court gathered for the last session, the morning was calm and quiet. A thin layer of mist hung over the city, and the old clock outside the courthouse rang 9 slow chimes that echoed through the street. Captain Edward Blake arrived early, as he always did. He sat on the same wooden bench by the window, holding his hat in both hands. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the tired peace of a man who had already lived through storms greater than any argument could bring. The medal on his chest gleamed faintly, catching the pale sunlight that filtered through the glass. Inside the courtroom, people were already whispering. The story of the royal guard who had been asked to remove his medal, and the judge who had later pinned it back on, had spread beyond the courthouse walls. Reporters had written about it, calling him the silent hero, though Edward never saw himself that way. He didn't like being called special. He only wanted the veterans' home to stay safe. That was his promise, and promises were sacred to him. When the judge entered, the room grew silent. Everyone rose. The gavel struck softly, and the judge spoke in a calm, respectful tone. "This court will now hear the final arguments in the case of Granton Properties versus the Royal Veterans Rest Home." Edward stood again, his back straight despite the stiffness in his shoulders. The young lawyer, Charles Grant, looked at him with quiet respect. His confident smile was gone. He wasn't the same man who had mocked the medal days before. He had learned something deeper, that sometimes victory has nothing to do with winning a case and everything to do with understanding the people before you. Charles spoke first, his voice gentler than usual. "Your Honor," he began, "the law may give Granton Properties certain rights to the land, but after hearing Captain Blake's testimony, I believe this is not only a matter of ownership, it's a matter of legacy. The land was built by men who gave their lives to protect others. They built that home not for profit but for honor, and I believe this court should protect that legacy." The judge looked surprised, and so did everyone else. The lawyer representing the corporation shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for this change in tone. Charles went on. "When this case began, I saw only paper and law. But now I see faces. The faces of those Captain Blake spoke for. People who gave up their youth, their families, their peace. I stand here not as a lawyer defending a company, but as a man asking for justice." There was silence. No one expected that speech. The corporation's lawyer stood up next, but his words felt hollow. He repeated legal terms, quoted property acts, and mentioned ownership rights, but his voice lacked conviction. Every sentence sounded small beside the memory of the old soldier's quiet strength. Then it was Edward's turn to speak. The judge allowed him to take the stand once more. He rose slowly, holding the edge of the bench for support, and walked toward the front of the room. "Every eye followed him, Your Honor," he said softly. "I'm not a man of law. I can't argue about papers or property. I only know what's right and what's fair. This home we built is more than a roof. It's a promise A promise that no one who served will be left alone in the end. He paused, his voice steady but full of emotion. The men who helped me build that place are gone now. Some of them had no families left. That home was their family. I gave them my word that it would always stand. And I'm here today because a promise should mean something. The judge's eyes softened. The room was completely still. Even the sound of the ticking clock seemed to fade. Edward looked down for a moment, then raised his eyes again. I don't ask for anything for myself. I just want to keep my word to those who can't be here to speak. I believe a man's duty doesn't end when the war is over. It continues, in how he lives, in how he remembers, and in how he keeps his promises. The judge leaned back, clearly moved. Captain Blake, he said quietly, this court has heard your words and it will remember them. After a short recess, everyone returned for the final decision. The judge held the written ruling in his hand. He looked out over the courtroom before speaking. This has been a case not only of property but of principle. The court recognizes the importance of the land in question, not as a legal asset but as a place of national memory. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that the Royal Veterans Rest Home shall remain in the care and protection of the Charity Foundation. A quiet gasp filled the room, followed by a wave of applause that broke through the usual courtroom decorum. The judge didn't stop it. He let it happen. For once, rules could wait. Edward stood motionless for a moment, the words sinking in slowly. His lips parted slightly as if to say something, but no words came. He looked down, then closed his eyes, whispering something to himself. Those close enough to hear caught only a few quiet words. They can rest now. The judge smiled gently. Captain Blake, he said, you may not realize it, but you've reminded us all of something very simple. That honor still matters. Edward nodded, his voice low. Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ever hoped for. As people began to leave, the young lawyer Charles Grant approached him again. He held out his hand and Edward shook it firmly. I learned more from you in 1 week than I did in all my years of law, Charles said. Edward smiled faintly. We all keep learning, son. That's how we stay human. Outside, the weather had cleared. The sky was pale blue and a cool breeze moved through the courtyard. Reporters tried to approach him, but Edward raised a polite hand. No interviews, he said kindly. This wasn't about me. Then he turned and began walking slowly toward the veteran's home. It took him nearly half an hour to reach the small building at the edge of town. The walls were old but strong, the garden neat, the flag gently waving above the entrance. A few of the residents were sitting outside in their wheelchairs, watching the clouds drift across the sky. When they saw Edward, they smiled and waved. He smiled back and walked over to them. One of the men, an old friend named George, asked eagerly, Well, Captain, what did they say? Edward's eyes softened. They said we get to keep our home. A cheer rose from the small group. Some laughed, some wiped their eyes, and one of the women began humming the tune of an old army song. Edward sat down beside them, his metal glinting softly in the sun. Later, as the evening light turned gold, he walked alone to the memorial stone near the garden gate. The names of fallen friends were carved there, weathered by rain and time. He ran his fingers over the familiar letters, whispering each one quietly. We kept our promise, he said softly. You're still home. The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves around him. It almost felt like a whisper in return. He stayed there for a while, just standing, his hat pressed against his chest. When he finally turned back toward the building, the windows glowed warmly in the sunset. Laughter came from inside, soft and full of life. For the first time in many years, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. He knew he had done what he was meant to do. That night, before sleeping, he placed the judge's letter and the court's written ruling inside a small wooden box. Beside them, he laid his Victoria Cross. He didn't need to wear it anymore. The world had already understood what it stood for. As he closed the box, he whispered quietly, It's home again. And though the world outside would move on, the story of the old Royal Guard and his medal would be told again and again, not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson about promises, courage, and quiet honor. The judge, too, never forgot that day. On his office desk, he kept a photograph of Captain Edward Blake, standing in the courtroom with his medal shining proudly against his chest. Beneath it, he had written one line in his own hand. Some battles are fought with silence, and one with dignity, and that was how the story of the old soldier ended. Not with grand speeches or fame, but with peace, promise, and the quiet respect of everyone who had seen what true honor really looked like.